What would have happened if Eren had survived the end of Attack on Titan? If Mikasa didn't kill him, it's guaranteed that Titan powers never would have disappeared, Eren probably would have made it back to the island, and the rumbling would have been 100% completed. This alternate reality could have been the real ending if one decision went the other way, and this wasn't the first time that a single choice could have flipped the entire timeline upside down. Other examples include Levi's decision to save Armin and Eren's decision to abandon the scouts. And in today's video, I'm going to recap the full alternate timeline where all these moments played out differently. Along the way, I'll explain every major event over a period of about 100 years, starting off with Erwin inheriting the Colossal Titan and ending a century later where Titans still exist. Speaking of Titans, this video is brought to you by the biggest gaming browser in the world, Opera GX. I guarantee whatever browser you currently use, Opera GX offers a level of customization, multitasking, and performance that's unmatched by the basic browsers most people use. If you click the link in my description and go to operagx.gg/turtlequirk, you can download Opera completely for free and try out the GX mods. GX mods allow you to customize the browser so it reflects your own personality and interests. For instance, right now I have this rumbling mod installed, which looked pretty terrifying, but recently I have also been using this Death Note one as well. Besides the dynamic wallpapers, a lot of mods also come with cool sound effects whenever you're typing on your keyboard or just opening a new tab. Certain mods also have background music as well, and a great thing about Opera is that you can select the best parts of each mod that you like to create a brand new theme that's specific to you. However, my friends, it doesn't end there because Opera has a ton of other features designed to make your browsing experience as smooth as humanly possible. An example is how on the sidebar here, you can easily tap into everyday apps like TikTok, Discord, Twitch, Spotify, and more with just a single click. On top of that, if you happen to be watching a video on YouTube, the video pop-out feature allows you to keep watching that while doing other things, and you can even resize the video and move it around, which is perfect if you feel like multitasking. Making the switch to Opera GX has never been easier thanks to the quick import tool, which in a few clicks will transfer all of your existing bookmarks, browsing history, and cookies from whatever browser you're currently using. That's why, in my opinion, there's no reason why you shouldn't at least give Opera a try, because if you're watching this, odds are a lot of these features will genuinely be useful for you. Thanks to Opera GX for sponsoring today's video, and if you want to support the channel and upgrade your browsing experience, then remember to use my link, which is operagx.gg/turtlequirk. With that said, let's move on to the video, as this branch timeline begins in Shiganshina with Levi injecting Erwin with the Titan transformation serum. Even when we look at the main series, this is the choice he originally planned to make, and by going through with it this time, Armin would die while the commander inherits the Colossal Titan. Thanks to this new Titan power, his missing right arm would fully grow back, and after waking up, the scouts would then head towards Grisha's basement. As we all know, they then discover the truth about the outside world, with Erwin fulfilling his lifelong dream in the process. That being said, while this moment would be great for him on a personal level, in the past he did say that when they retake Walmaria, the next step should be to eliminate threats outside the walls. To now discover that this threat is actually just the entire planet, there's no way someone like Erwin would just, sit back, relax, and wait for them to get annihilated by Marley. Instead, what he'd do is he'd spend the following months rebuilding the Survey Corps from scratch, with his old friend Niall defecting from the MPs in order to join the Scouts. At the same time, Eren would be suffering a lot in the aftermath of Armin's death, and it's natural that his hatred for Marley would grow even more intensely than it did in the original show. However, when he kisses Historia's hand at the medal ceremony, he would still be freaked out by the visions he sees of the rumbling, and for now at least, he wouldn't want to take things that far. Moving on to the year 851, Marley would send their first fleet of survey ships to inspect the island, and on board would be Yelena, Onyankopon, and the rest of Zeke's anti-Marleyan volunteers. By speaking to them, the scouts would learn that Marley is currently fighting a war in the Middle East, and therefore doesn't have the manpower to fully invade the island. For Erwin, he'd see this as a massive opportunity, unlike all of the hopeless people in the main show, because with their main enemy being distracted, there was a real chance here for Paradis to either launch some kind of attack of their own or form alliances with the Middle East. In order for these ideas to become a reality though, the fact is the scouts would have to work with the volunteers, which is kind of risky considering their relationship with Zeke. Regardless, I do still think that Erwin would take that risk, and with the help of the volunteers, a brand new port would be constructed on the island. In the year 852, Ambassador Kiyomi would then make the journey to Paradis, and this meeting would be massively important. By now, Erwin would have had over a year to work on his plan, and during this process he would have realized certain things. Firstly, because Marley relies so heavily on Titan powers, the rest of their military is pretty outdated compared to the rest of the world. This means the best thing the scouts can do is to focus on defeating the warriors, because if they can do that, then a more advanced military like Hizuru or some other country, they can swoop in to finish Marley off. The second thing he'd realize is that if Eldia wants to have a chance of making allies and improving their reputation, then there's no way they can ever use the rumbling under any circumstance. Right now, every country believes they're an island full of devils, so doing the rumbling, even a tiny rumbling, it would only justify the world's hatred. That's why in this timeline, both Eren and Erwin would reject Zeke's plan, which, in case you forgot, Zeke was proposing that they do a small-scale rumbling to scare off other countries, and also that they turn Historia into a royal-blooded titan so that the island can maintain that rumbling power. Instead of doing this, the commander would pitch his strategy to Kiyomi, and to be fair, the anime did show us that she was open to hearing other ideas. By the end of the meeting, I think the two of them would agree to a deal that massively benefits both sides, with the scouts gaining access to Hizuru's weapons and tech, in exchange for Hizuru gaining access to a large chunk of the island's natural resources, which, in case you forgot, that was like 99% of the reason they came here in the first place. Now, before we move on, it's worth noting that Eren would be a lot happier at this stage in the timeline, because thanks to Erwin there would now be a clear plan to get revenge on Marley, avoid a full-scale rumbling, and protect Historia from becoming a Titan. Those three things were obviously majorly important to him, so now that there's a clear plan, I think he would put his faith in it and wouldn't feel the need, at least not at this point, to go off and do his own thing. Flashing forward 2 years, at this time Marley would still be fighting in the Middle East, even though the warriors would be back home in Liberia. The reason for this is that months earlier, the Tybur family received proof that Eren is hiding on the Marlyean continent. Since then, there'd be searches for him across the whole country, while back at military HQ, all of Marley's Titans would be on standby. Their primary mission would be to defend the mainland from any Titan attacks, but the downside to them all being here is that Marley would begin to lose the Middle Eastern War. As a result, Mikasa would plan to send the Beast and Cart Titans back to the front lines, and this moment is when Erwin would finally make a move. On one particular night, Zeke would invite his comrades and their parents round to his house for dinner as a way of saying goodbye before he leaves the country. After a few hours of drinking wine and just relaxing, Reiner and Porco would then head back home with their parents, while Zeke and Peak would walk back to HQ. Along the way there, they'd stop off in this building where Mikasa would be waiting for them, or at least that's what Zeke would say. As soon as Peak steps inside, he then activates this trapdoor, which was actually put there by Marley in case they needed to contain any Titan shifters. With the Cart Titan trapped underground, Hanji and Nal would then enter the room, and their job would basically be to make sure that she doesn't escape. At the same time, in another part of Liberia, Reiner's luck would be even worse as he'd arrive home to find Eren in his childhood bedroom. In this timeline, with Armin being dead, we have to ask ourselves, how would Eren respond differently when he finally sees the warriors again? During season 4, he had no issue tearing up an apartment block full of people, so in this new reality, he'd likely want to do something a little bit more personal, like, for example, targeting Reiner's mother. By transforming into his Titan while she's still in the house, Karina would get burnt up by the lightning, and anything of her that happened to survive, it would just get crushed under the rubble of Reiner's house. Meanwhile, switching back to Zeke, he and Erwin would come face to face for the first time since the Beast Titan tried to kill him. Despite the history there, the two of them would now be on the same side though, and their goal right now would be to wipe out Marley's chain of command. Currently, Magath, General Calvi, and other high-ranking officers would be gathered at HQ, so by destroying that building, Marley's army would become way too disorganized to handle the next step of Erwin's plan. For that reason, Zeke would transform into his Beast Titan in the middle of the street, and then throw the commander outside the internment zone. 4 years ago, the warriors used this exact same tactic with Bertolt, and once Erwin gets in the right position, he'd flatten HQ and a large chunk of Liberia. On the inside of the internment zone, Porco would naturally feel the ground shaking, and as he leaves his house to investigate what's going on, the very first thing he'd see is Reiner getting beaten up. Instinctively, the Jaw Titan would want to jump in and help his fellow warrior, but just like in the anime, Galliard would be seriously unprepared to handle the Island Devils. The most likely outcome is that Levi chops off his limbs to stop him going anywhere, just as Sasha, Connie, and the other scouts blow Reiner out of the Armored Titan. Simultaneously, back at HQ, Erwin would be waiting for the next phase of the plan to begin, and it would all start once these airships appear behind him. Similar to the original timeline, Hizuru would have used the island's natural resources to develop their own tech, and in preparation for this war, they'd have an entire fleet of airships and a handful of flying boats. These aircrafts would be essential for attacking Marley on a larger scale, because Liberia would be just the first of several major targets. As Erwin then exits the Colossal, back in the internment zone, the Beast Titan would find the other scouts. By this point, Reiner would be tied up on the ground in his human form, while the Jaw Titan still wouldn't have any limbs, but when Zeke shows up, Galliard would understandably feel like they're about to be saved. Pretty quickly though, it wouldn't take him very long to realize that there's something going on, as none of the scouts, not even Eren, would be reacting to the Beast Titan's appearance. Moments later, Flock would then swoop down to the ground, and in his hand he'd be holding this vial of liquid. Without any hesitation, he'd then down the entire thing in one go, as everyone else just watches on from the rooftops. Following this, Zeke would let out a scream that would be heard across Liberia, and by doing this, he transformed Flock into one of his pure titans. For a bit of context here, in the year 853, when the scouts were preparing for war, soldiers had to apply if they wanted to inherit one of Marley's titans. After a super long process, Flock was chosen for the armoured, Louise was selected for the jaw, and Hanji selected herself as the one to inherit the cart titan. When the scouts then arrived in Marley, Zeke provided them with vials of his own spinal fluid, so that in this exact situation, Flock would be able to follow his commands. However, as Flock charges forward to eat Reiner, a spike of Titan hardening would randomly erupt out of the ground. Earlier I mentioned how all of Marley's shifters were waiting at HQ for updates, and this included Lara Tybur, who would have been sent there as a backup option in case the warriors failed. When Erwin blew up HQ, Lara definitely would have been caught up in the explosion, and now she'd arrive on the battlefield to find Zeke working with the enemy. Regardless, even though the Warhammer Titan is powerful, Mikasa would instantly be able to knock it down with Thunder Spears, while the Beast Titan would call for reinforcements. Previously, during dinner, Zeke fed his spinal fluid to everyone who was there, partly so he could blackmail the warriors if he needed to, but also so that he'd have Titan reinforcements if anything went wrong. By the way, as a small detail, Peak's dad and Porco's parents would have transformed at the exact same time as Flock, which is why we can see these two other lights going off in the distance. Anyway, it wouldn't take long for them all to swarm Lara Tybur, and during the chaos, Levi would just, go down and grab Reiner to make sure he doesn't accidentally get killed. What follows this would be the Warhammer Titan trying and failing to deal with Mikasa and the Pure Titans, which, to be fair, that's not easy dealing with both those things at the exact same time. And in the past, Magath did say that her power runs out pretty quickly. Once that moment of exhaustion eventually comes, Zeke would advise Eren on how to break the crystal, because he'd know more than anyone just how strong Porco's Jaw Titan is. Listening to his brother's advice, Eren would use Galliard's jaw to crush Lara to pieces, and although this was never part of the plan, he'd gain her Warhammer abilities. As he then goes off script to try and eat Porco as well, he'd get interrupted by Erwin, who'd finally arrive back in the internment zone. At this moment, his main priority would be for the three candidates to eat their titans, with Flock going up first to eat Reiner, and Louise getting ready to go up next. In preparation for Hanji going third, Levi would be sent to retrieve her and the cart titan, but by the time he arrives, all he'd see is the building up in flames. On the inside, the captain would find the burning remains of Hanji and Nile, and as if that wasn't bad enough, the cart titan wouldn't be inside the trapdoor. This is because on the streets of Liberia, Peak would now be on the run, having escaped with the help of Commander Magath. The two of them would have then gone in the direction of all the chaos, and they'd get there just in time to witness Louise emerging from her titan. Judging from that sight, Mikasa would instantly know that at least one of the warriors has to be dead, and as he scans the area, he'd notice Zeke calmly standing next to 3 of his pure titans. By now, the commander would be fully aware of Zeke's betrayal thanks to Pyke, but what would surprise him about the situation is how strongly these titans resemble the warrior parents. In fact, I reckon Pyke would probably have like a rare mental break when she sees that this is her dad, but before she can do anything, the scouts would kill him and the rest of Zeke's titans. To understand why, the first thing we need to explain is Erwin's strategy for when the scouts leave Liberia. With Hizuru's assistance, the idea was the Cervical would split into separate teams who would each target different locations within Marley. These locations include the airship base in Fort Salta, the naval port in Carafa, and just several military bases across the continent. Given that Marley has lost its titans, its leaders, and their navy is getting trashed in the Middle East, destroying these locations would be the final nail in the coffin. When it comes to Fort Salta specifically, because it's so far away from Liberia, that team would leave immediately once Louise gets her titan. For everyone else, they'd stick around to quickly watch Hanji eat the car titan, with Erwin ordering Zeke's titans to be destroyed in preparation for everyone leaving the city. That said, once Levi arrives back with the news that Pyke has escaped and Hanji and Nal are dead, that would force the commander to make a decision. His plan was always to capture all 4 of the warriors to leave Marley as weakened as possible, but at the same time, the Cart Titan by itself isn't a huge threat. While it would be ideal to get revenge for Nal and Hanji, if the scouts were to waste time trying to find Pyke, then it would only delay the more pressing things they have to do. For that reason, Erwin would order the scouts to just pull out of Liberia, as they'd each have specific airships that they need to get on. Sadly for Jean, he was the one who happened to kill Pyke's dad, and she'd make it a point to ambush him before he gets out of the internment zone. Sasha and Connie would be the ones to witness this, and although they chase after him, Pyke obviously knows the zone a lot better than they do. Eventually, her and Mikasa would take Jean to an abandoned building where they intimidate and basically torture him into giving them information, and from this, the one thing they'd learn is that Zeke is a Titan of royal blood. After finding this out, Mikasa and Pyke would make the long journey to Marley's capital city, where the next day they'd meet with Willy Tybur. By this point, Willy would of course know about the death of his sister, and it goes without saying he'd feel extreme levels of grief, but also extreme levels of humiliation. For the Tybur family's prized possession to be stolen for the first time ever, yeah, that would be pretty embarrassing, and Willy would be desperate to avenge his sister and just get it back. The problem is that by now, Marley would have suffered an insane amount of losses, especially in Fort Salta, which would have been burnt to the ground by Eren, Flock and Louise. The end result of this is that Marley would have no airships left, not to mention their biggest port would get trampled by Erwin and Zeke. Realistically, this would put Marley in a position where it can't defend itself from these constant Titan attacks, and if things were to get any worse, there's a realistic chance that other nations will attack them as well. For that reason, when Kiyomi calls Willy offering to make a deal, he would have to sit down and listen to what she has to say. On this call, the ambassador would represent both Hizuru and Paradis, and she threatened to continue this Titan rampage until Marley gives them what they want. For now, Kiyomi's 3 main demands would be that number 1, Marley surrenders and stops any resistance, number 2, they pull all of their forces out of the Middle East, and number 3, the Tybur family steps away from their position. From the beginning, Kiyomi said her goal was to restore Hizuru to its former glory, and by kicking the Tyburs out of Marley by force, there's a chance for Hizuru to replace those positions with their own people as they take control of the continent. Understandably, Willy wouldn't want any of those things to happen, but after strategizing with Mikasa and Pyke, the 3 of them would come up with an idea. Back in the original timeline, we saw that Willy does have a good political instinct, and he knew exactly what to do and exactly what to say to convince people to join his side. That same skill would be useful for them in this branch timeline as well, but realistically, it would take months to launch any kind of fight back against Paradis. That's why on the phone, Willy would agree to Kiyomi's demands, and Marley would officially surrender. Unofficially though, this wouldn't be the end of things, as Willy would immediately flee the country along with Pyke, Mikasa and the rest of his family. For the rest of the world, this would all have massive consequences, but first, let's do a recap of what would happen on the island over the next few weeks and months. Following their victory in Marley, which was thanks to years worth of planning from Erwin, Premier Zachary would announce his intention to retire. As Commander-in-Chief, Zachary is in charge of all 3 military branches, but given that Erwin is the one who retook Wall Maria and defeated their biggest enemy, no one would be more qualified for that role. However, due to Hanji's death, the scouts wouldn't have an obvious successor to take over from him, and so for that reason, I imagine Erwin's promotion would be put on hold until he'd be certain that the scouts can function without him. At the same time, Eren wouldn't be the happiest person, because although the plan in Marley was a success, he'd return home to find out that Jean was killed in Liberia. After his interrogation, Commander Magath would have executed him on the spot, with Sasha and Connie finding his body a short time later. This death would spoil the mood for pretty much everyone in their friendship group, and once again, Eren would feel an incredible amount of bitterness towards the outside world. In terms of other changes on the island, the next inheritor of the female Titan would also be a big issue. For the past 4 years, Annie would have been chilling inside her crystal, but with Eren gaining the Warhammer's power and with Louise gaining the Jaw Titan, breaking that crystal suddenly became possible. Logically speaking, you'd expect a member of the scouts to be chosen for it, but for political reasons, the military police would want one of their people selected. Despite being the most prestigious branch, the MPs gained a bad reputation for laziness and just general corruption, and the success of the scouts only made them look even worse by comparison. After a lot of discussions, Hitch was eventually selected for the female Titan, not because she was the best candidate, but because, as Annie's former roommate, her story of being betrayed had the best chance of resonating with the public. Of course, the problem with Hitch is that, like Marlo said, she's someone who prefers to live the easy life, so there's no way she'd just agree to something this serious. To win her over, not only would her family be offered life-changing amounts of money for the next 13 years, but the MPs would impose a set of anti-corruption reforms, which is something that Hitch knew Marlo wanted to happen. As a result, 7 months after the victory against Marley, Annie's crystal would get crushed by Eren, who by now would have had some time to perfect his control of the Warhammer Titan. In the process, Hitch would become the 5th member of the newly formed Titan Defense Squad alongside Eren, Erwin, Flock, and Louise. This group would be their equivalent to Marley's warriors, and as the name suggests, their role would be to protect the island from any external threats. When it comes to the Beast Titan though, who you probably noticed wasn't involved here, he'd be locked up deep underground in a prison made specifically for him. From the first day his volunteers arrived on the island, I don't think there's any doubt that Erwin would have been suspicious of Zeke's motives, in particular his desire to meet with Eren. At the same time though, the commander would be willing to use Zeke and his volunteers, but someone as experienced as him would know that only bad things can happen by putting these two in a room together. That's why the two brothers were purposely put on different teams during the Marlyean War, and it's why on the way back to the island, Levi cut him up. Since then, he'd be trapped underground miles away from Shiganshina, and in the year 855, Zachary would start vetting candidates to inherit the Beast Titan. Meanwhile, switching back to Marley, the continent would now fully be under Hizuru's control. In the years since the war, they would have made several big decisions, for example, giving independence to most of the colonized nations. This move would definitely help to restore their reputation in the eyes of many people, but at the same time, they'd be hated by others due to their association with Paradis. For most of the world, Eldia would still be viewed as an island full of devils, and although the threat of Marley would be gone, the fact is that these devils now have 8 of the 9 titans. That makes them more dangerous than the warriors ever were, and politicians around the world would genuinely be afraid that what happened to Marley might also happen to them. For the past year, Willy Tybur would have used that fear to his advantage, utilizing his influence and connections to rally certain nations against Hizuru and Paradis. This would be easy for him to do, given that 1, the island is already hated, 2, politicians do actually listen to him, and 3, we've already seen the exact argument he would use to convince people to join his side. After a year of going from country to country and applying political pressure, a military alliance would form between all the nations who want to prevent the rumbling. This would be ironic given that Erwin and the rest of the island had no intention of doing a rumbling, but regardless, the creation of this global alliance would lead to a brand new conflict in 855 when they launch a surprise attack against Paradis. For purely strategic reasons, the first place they'd target would be Zeke's prison, because as the only Titan of royal blood, killing him would make it impossible for Eren to use the Founder. After sneaking in, Peak would be the one to confront him while the fighting continues above ground, and in the end, her Cart Titan would literally chomp him in half. Meanwhile, in Shiganshina, Historia and the Titan squad would be gathered for a meeting when they suddenly get news about the invasion. At this point in time, they wouldn't know whether Zeke is dead or not, but based on the context, anyone who would attack the prison is clearly looking for Zeke, either to kidnap him or to kill him. From Eren's point of view, this would seriously piss him off because if the island really is under attack, then it means all the effort they put into finding peace, it'd basically be for nothing. Secondly, if his brother has been killed, then it greatly increases the chances of Historia being turned into a Titan, given that she's the last person with royal blood and she'd be needed if the island had to protect itself with the rumbling. Erwin would be aware of this possibility as well, and it's why his main priority right now would be to save Zeke if he can still be saved, while also making sure that nothing happens to Historia until they know the situation. To achieve this, Flock and the commander would immediately head towards the prison, along with Levi and an army of scouts, while the 3 remaining Titans would be ordered to stay behind with Historia. Around an hour later, the Survey Corps would then arrive at the jail to find it's been taken over by enemy soldiers, and what follows this would be an all-out war between the two sides. For the scouts, Colossal Erwin would personally crush the airships flying overhead, while down on the ground, the Armored Titan would have his hands pretty full. During the fighting though, he'd unexpectedly get injured by an anti-Titan cannon, and this would be important since this type of cannon is only made in the Middle East. For the past few years, Hizuru, the Middle East, and Paradis would have all been working together behind the scenes, especially for the attack on Marley, so for this weapon to be here, it implies that someone must have betrayed the island. Simultaneously, back in Shiganshina, things wouldn't be looking too good as hundreds of fighters from the Global Alliance would descend onto Walmaria. Strapped to each of their backs would be eldians who'd all be sedated by this point, and after arriving on top of the wall, all of them would be lined up next to each other. Inside HQ, Eren and the others would watch on as each of these people are then injected with the Titan transformation serum and immediately begin rampaging through the district. For Willy Tybur, this would all be a tactic to force Eren to reveal himself, because there's only so long he'd be able to stand by and watch as his hometown gets destroyed again. Sure enough, eventually the attack Titan would fall for the bait, and along with Mikasa and a bunch of other scouts, they try their best to defend the civilians. After a lot of hesitation, Hitch would join the fight as well, which would be her first time ever using the female Titan in combat. Unfortunately though, Willy Tybur and Commander Magath would be perched on top of Walmaria, and in Magath's case, he'd be inside an anti-Titan cannon. Thanks to intel they received from a certain person, these two would know nearly all of the island's military secrets, including obviously Zeke's location, and the fact that on this day, the Queen and the Titan Defense Squad would all be in the same place. Using that information, the Global Alliance was able to create a 4-stage plan, which was to kill Zeke to prevent any chance of the rumbling, steal the founder by having a random pure Titan eat Eren, eliminate any shifters who get in the way, and finally, launch a ground invasion to kidnap the royal-blooded queen. Bearing this in mind, Magath's mission was to make sure Eren gets eaten by one of the pure Titans, hence why he'd shoot through the attack Titan's brain. In theory, this would paralyze him long enough for one of the pure Titans to take advantage. However, Hitch would be the one to protect him as she cuts them down with Eren's Warhammer sword. In response, Magath, who is the best marksman in the Global Alliance, he'd fire a shot that instantly rips through the female Titan's neck. Unlike the shot he fired against Eren, this one would be designed to shred Hitch's human body, because like I said, the Alliance don't really care about most of the Titan shifters. As long as they acquire the founder and Historia, then in time they'll have control over not just every Titan, but every subject of Ymir on the planet. Sadly for Hitch, she'd just be collateral damage of this plan, and inside HQ, Louise and Historia would be horrified at the way things are playing out. Switching over to Erwin, having confirmed Zeke's death, he and the scouts would urgently head back to Shiganshina. One person who wouldn't be with them though is Captain Levi, as he would have stayed behind at the prison to deal with the new and improved Cart Titan. Having already eaten Zeke, Peak Shifter would now be this weird hybrid between the cart and beast, which means she would gain certain new abilities, like for example, enhanced speed and enhanced sense of smell, which would be good for tracking people down. In Levi's case, all he'd want is to kill her and get revenge for what happened to Hanji, but even for him, Peak would be causing a few problems. Due to the Cart Titan's unlimited stamina combined with the Beast Titan's speed, Peak would be able to evade most of his attacks. Her plan here would simply be to outlast him physically, because she'd know from his first fight with Zeke that in certain situations Levi can get exhausted. When that opening finally comes, Peak would then run into the forest, because with Flock being injured and with Erwin having recently used the Colossal, neither of these two would have the energy to transform. This meant there was a real chance for her to potentially eat both of them, and in the blink of an eye, Peak would rapidly catch up to the scouts within 20 minutes. However, just as she was about to rip the commander in half like she did to Zeke, Erwin's consciousness would suddenly get transported to the past dimension. The reason this would happen is that back in Shiganshina, with Eren on the verge of getting eaten, someone had to make an important decision. Given that Hitch would be dead by this point and there'd be pure titans swarming the area, there was a real risk that at least one of these titans would slip past the scouts. If that was to happen, the island would pretty much be done for, because without Eren, they'd lose their strongest weapon. Therefore, to guarantee the future for Paradis, Historia and Louise would have to have a pretty difficult conversation. As we all know, the key to unlocking Eren's power is a royal-blooded titan, but with Zeke's status being unknown at this time, they couldn't afford to wait any longer for news. For Paradis to fight back in this specific moment, Louise ultimately would have to sacrifice herself so that Historia could step into that role. That's why after eating the Jaw Titan, the Queen would drag herself through the streets of Shiganshina as Mikasa clears a path by eliminating any nearby titans. On top of Walmaria, Willy Tybur would eventually notice what's going on here, but before he or Magath can react, Connie would blow Magath to pieces with a Thunder Spear. Following this, the Queen would make physical contact with Eren, instantly sending both of them to paths. At first, Eren would be slightly confused about how they got here because he wouldn't know about Historia being a Titan shifter, but after finding out what happened, I think it's safe to say he'd be raging. As a Titan shifter, not only is Historia's lifespan now reduced, but because she has royal blood, it's inevitable that she'll be pressured to have as many kids as possible during the next 13 years. Given the success that the scouts had in Liberia, Eren believed that this kind of future had finally been 100% avoided, but unfortunately the outside world's fear of eldians is still forced them to this point. Historia and Eren would then argue back and forth over whether her becoming a Titan was the right decision, when out of nowhere, the founder Ymir would suddenly make an appearance. Unlike the main series, when Zeke spent years with Ymir learning how to break the vow-renouncing war, in this scenario, Historia simply wouldn't have that time. As a direct result of that, Eren would be the one in control, which according to Titan science is exactly what's supposed to happen. This is how Commander Erwin would end up getting summoned to the past dimension, because with the situation in Shiganshina being so bad, logically Eren would want to know if the commander or Captain Levi are close by. From this conversation, they'd hear about everything that happened at the prison, including Zeke's death and the presence of Middle Eastern weapons. In Eren's head, this betrayal would confirm something that he already started to believe, which is that nothing they try will ever change the world's perception of Eldians. In fact, this would pretty much lead to him accepting that the future he saw 4 years ago was unavoidable, and more than that, he'd now have an excuse to wipe the slate clean and create a world that's more similar to the one from Armin's book. Understandably, Erwin and Historia would see that as insanity, because now that Paradis has the founder under its control, a small-scale rumbling would be the most proportionate response. By now though, Eren's mind would be made up for the reasons I mentioned, and despite Historia pleading with him, he'd unleash every last Titan inside the walls. All over the island, every Colossal would begin marching towards the sea, while in Shiganshina specifically, something else would happen as well. In a flash, every pure Titan in the district would get struck by lightning, reverting each one of them back to their human forms. Remember, these people were just innocent eldians brought here against their will, and most of them would have no idea how they got here in the first place. To protect Mikasa, Historia, and the other scouts, Eren would reverse their transformations and the transformations of one other person. In a nearby forest, Peak would get struck by a violent burst of lightning, forcing her Titan body to just melt away. Although her Titan powers wouldn't permanently be gone or anything, for the first time ever she wouldn't have any stamina left to transform. As she lies there barely conscious, most of her comrades in the Global Alliance would get trampled by the rumbling, and several hours later, Premier Zachary would call an emergency meeting. By this point, everyone here would know the full details of what happened, and there'd be differing opinions on how they should respond. From Flock's point of view, Eren's global massacre would be 100% justified, and he'd argue that stopping the rumbling would put Paradis in a dangerous position. In his opinion, any nation that survives would only rise up against them in the future, and so the safest option is to let Eren trample everything. By contrast, Historia would believe that not everyone off the island is an enemy, and she'd suspect that anyone, even Eren, would have doubts about murdering the whole human race. Similarly, Erwin would have doubts of his own, because even if they were attacked first, the level of bloodshed that Eren's doing, it goes way beyond what's necessary. What follows this would be a debate about whether they should try to stop him, and during this discussion, Historia would reveal something. Earlier that day, when she was briefly unconscious after eating Louise, the Queen saw memories of a previous Titan shifter. In these visions, she experienced a handful of moments from the girl's life, but by far the most clear memory was one of her flying over the battlefield. In that moment, Historia had the innate feeling that she was the same, possibly due to her royal blood or the fact that Louise's Titan did have some animalistic traits that were inherited from the Beast Titan's DNA. Whatever the reason, the ability to fly is something she'd feel like she can do, which would make reaching Eren a real possibility. Although Floch would again argue his case for why they shouldn't interfere, Erwin would cut him off to explain what they should do next. Step 1. Arrangements would be made for Historia to test her powers in the morning, and if she can fly, then they'll make plans to locate the founding Titan. From there, they'll try to talk with Eren and hopefully convince him to reduce the scale of the destruction, but the commander would reassure Floch that whatever happens, they don't plan to hurt Eren in any way. Step 2. Because of the global alliance, the island now has hundreds of refugees from across the sea, and overnight the goal would be to set up camp for these people and for the residents of Shiganshina. Finally, step 3 would be to interrogate Willy Tybur, who would have been taken hostage shortly after Magath was killed. Erwin's goal here would be to find out which nations supported the alliance, so at least Paradis can know who their real enemies are. That's why the following morning, Willy would wake up to find Levi and the commander waiting outside his cell. Although at first he'd be pretty hostile towards them, we have to remember here that with the rumbling marching all night, it's only a matter of time until all his kids and the rest of the world are squashed to pieces by Eren. Being reminded of this fact is what would eventually get Willy to be a little bit more open, cause with the alliance being defeated, the scouts are now literally the only people who can stop it. In the end, Willy would confirm Erwin's suspicions, which is that the alliance was supported by both the Middle East and Hizuru as well. Although it is true that Kiyomi never had a problem with Eldians, ultimately she'll always put the interests of her own country over the interests of Paradis. For context, earlier I mentioned how Hizuru would be hated by certain countries around the world due to their relationship with the island. As more and more nations then signed up for the global alliance, naturally the number of enemies the Hizuru has, it would continue to grow. In recent months, this would result in economic sanctions against the Azumabito clan, which was something they did to force Kiyomi to negotiate. Eventually, a deal was struck in which she agreed to pass them information, including Zeke's location among other things, and in exchange, Hizuru would gain two things. Number 1, all economic sanctions would be lifted now and forever, and number 2, if the alliance were to win the war, then Asia would have exclusive control over all of Paradis' natural resources. This was the proposal that Willy made to her, and if it had worked, it would have been a way better deal for Hizuru than their current arrangement. However, for Willy, none of this stuff would really matter anymore, because the only thing he'd want right now is for his kids to be saved. Knowing what he knows about Erwin, Willy would believe that the scouts will find a way to do it, but he'd warn the commander that killing Eren might be the only way for there to be peace. After all, the Tyburs are living proof that humans and Eldians can trust each other under the right circumstances, but if the scouts were to allow Eren to live after what he's done, it's unlikely that trust would ever form between the island and the outside world. Before Erwin can respond, Mikasa would suddenly burst into the room with an urgent update about Historia. Flashing forward 24 hours, inside Liberia, the earth would start to shake as Eren leads his titans towards the city. Within the internment zone, Gabi, Falco, and the rest of the warrior candidates would all be pretty helpless, cause after the damage the scouts did to Fort Salta, there wouldn't be any safe places to run to. When that attack happened a year ago, all of the candidates were in the Middle East, and ever since they got back, Gabi would be depressed since her aunt, cousin, and both of her parents were killed by the island devils. For Eren to now come back to finish the rest of them off, that would feel especially cruel, and she'd be frozen as the rumbling approaches. However, just as things seemed completely hopeless, a Titan would fly overhead, and on its back would be Erwin, Floch, Mikasa, and Captain Levi. Right now, their mission would be to distract Eren long enough for Historia to make physical contact. If successful, this would give them one final chance to talk things out in the past dimension, but in the back of Mikasa's head, she'd be wondering what they plan to do if this doesn't work. As Historia then flies over the rumbling, her Titan would release a blast of superheated steam, burning the napes of over a dozen wall titans. Similar to the Colossal, her shifter is able to burn muscle mass to generate steam, but instead of emitting that steam, she can store it internally. When the heat then builds up to a certain temperature, Historia can release it all in one go, torching pretty much anything that happens to be in the way. The downside to this power though is that, like I said, she has to burn muscle mass to do this, meaning there needs to be a long regeneration period before she can do it again. Anyway, with an entire section of Wall Titans being wiped out, Eren would genuinely be shocked by the attempt to stop him. In this timeline, because of the way the rumbling came about, he wouldn't have laid the groundwork for his friends to oppose him like this, and he'd have no prior knowledge of how the rumbling might end. That's why seeing Mikasa, Floch and the rest of them would actually be surprising, and as Eren stays deep in thought, the commander would trigger his colossal transformation. As Erwin then directly blocks the attack titan's path, Historia would then speed towards Eren, because for the plan to work, all she has to do is make the faintest contact. However, just as she's an inch away from touching the founder, a bright flash of light would suddenly engulf the Jaw Titan and everyone on board. To explain why, we need to flash back a couple days to when the scouts were discussing what they need to do. During that meeting, Floch was incredibly paranoid, because to him, the idea of sparing their enemies, it ultimately would mean the death of the island. Around him though, no one else would be taking it as seriously, as, Erwin and the others seemed to believe that life could continue even if the rumbling stopped. That's why, the night before the commander had his meeting with Willy Tybur, Floch hired one of the guards to report back everything that was said. From this, he heard about Willy Tybur's recommendation to kill Eren, which is something he already suspected would be on the cards. Of course, with Eren currently being in control of the founder, the only ones who could realistically kill him are the Ackermans, since they're the only ones unaffected by that power. To guarantee that they wouldn't stop the rumbling, Floch would vow to do whatever it takes, even if that meant betraying his comrades. For that reason, he played along so that he'd be allowed on this mission, and then when the moment presented itself, the armoured titan triggered his own transformation. Doing this so close to his comrades would be like setting off a bomb in their faces, or in this case I guess a thunder spear is a better comparison. As the Ackermans and Historia then plummet towards the ground, Erwin and Eren would watch on in disbelief. It was established a long time ago that the Colossal Titan's biggest weakness is how slow it is and its lack of agility, and in this case here it would mean that neither of them would be able to grab the Ackermans in time. Just like when his mother was eaten, Eren would be helpless as the most important person in his life crashes into the earth at full speed. For Floch, this would be a necessary evil to guarantee the island's future, but there would be one detail he wouldn't know. Ever since Armin's death 5 years earlier, the relationship between Mikasa and Eren would definitely have evolved in a different way. The shared grief they'd have about the situation, that does often bring people closer together, and plausibly, it would cause Eren to be more open about his emotions. Now, I'm not saying Armin being dead means that he'd suddenly tell Mikasa everything, but what I do think is that they'd have to confide in each other about their grief relating to Armin. Over the years, that would lead to them opening up more and more about certain other things, eventually manifesting into the relationship they both clearly wanted. Floch, however, would have no idea about this, because with the hostile political climate, the two of them would have been keeping their romance a secret until things calmed down. In fact, one of Eren's more selfish motivations for doing the rumbling is that by eliminating the outside threat, it'd give them a chance to literally just retire from the military and live out his final years in peace. That potential future would now have been taken away from him by the armoured titan, who in the blink of an eye would find himself in parts. Initially, Floch would be trapped in this exact position for what felt like days, but as days turned to weeks and weeks turned to months, he'd eventually become more and more delirious. On very rare occasions, he'd see visions of Eren standing in front of him and promising to make him suffer and die in the worst way possible, but due to the nature of the situation, he wouldn't be certain if any of that was real. As the months then turned to years, Floch would suffer from frequent hallucinations, panic attacks, and he just never know if what he sees is a figment of his imagination. Meanwhile, in reality, only a handful of seconds would have passed, as Erwin would react not so kindly to what he's just seen. Ordinarily, the commander is the type of person who stays focused on the mission even when people are dying all around him, but to be betrayed by someone who he trusted to have the armoured titan, I feel like that would be the thing that would send him over the edge. Before he can do anything though, Erwin's surroundings would abruptly change as he suddenly finds himself in Shiganshina with Eren. Just from looking around, he'd instantly realize this is one of the founding titans' tricks, given that they'd both be frozen in time. Inside this dimension, nothing except himself and Eren would be able to move, and as the commander looks down, he'd see an old memory of Captain Levi. I probably don't need to explain that this specific memory is from 5 years earlier, when Levi had to decide who would inherit the Colossal Titan. At the time, Mikasa and Eren obviously fought for Armin to be chosen. However, in the present day, Eren would now believe that regardless of who was saved, neither Armin or Erwin would have been able to stop the rumbling. The truth is that as long as subjects of Ymir can become titans, then the rest of humanity does have a right to be afraid of them. That fear is why it's so difficult for eldians and humans to coexist, but until recently, Eren had deluded himself into thinking that Erwin could find a way. Sadly, even their best leader wasn't able to find a peaceful solution, and so Eldia's only remaining options are to either destroy humanity or wait for humanity to destroy them. In response, the commander would mention that even if this is the case, it is a bit nonsensical to kill billions of people for the freedom of one tiny island. Whichever way you want to look at it, the rumbling is objectively wrong and disproportionate, but after going back and forth debating this, it'd be clear to Erwin that Eren's mind is already made up. Because of that, the commander would decide to at least attempt to save as many people as he can, and to do this, he'd have to remind Eren of their history. 100 years ago, when Karl Fritz erected the walls and trapped them behind it, it wasn't only their freedom that he took away. The reality is that Eldians from across the sea also lost their freedom as well, and if it wasn't for their sacrifices, the Eldians inside the walls wouldn't have made it to where they are. For example, people like Grisha and Kruger, they were both born and raised in Liberia, and it was only thanks to their actions that Eldians on the island were able to fight back. Continuing this train of thought, the commander would suggest that Eldians born outside the walls aren't any different from them, and if Eren truly wants them to be free, then that freedom should at least be extended to Eldians all around the world. Of course, the main question is how do you do that when everything and everyone is getting trampled, but I think Erwin would offer a practical solution. As the rumbling continues to march, the founder can transform these people into massive Colossus Titans, who can then join him on his rampage across the globe. Once it's all over, they can then start brand new lives on Paradis, but at first Eren would be majorly skeptical about this plan, given that a lot of Eldians from across the sea are going to hate him for destroying their homes. I think Erwin would also have to acknowledge that possibility, but he'd know for a fact that there are at least some people who'd just be grateful that their families were saved in the first place. A proposal like this would definitely be a lot for Eren to process, but after thinking back to his dad's memories, he would accept that maybe the commander has a point. It can't be denied that Eldians from across the sea laid the foundation for everything Eren achieved, and so for him to turn around and kill people just like them, it would be pretty messed up. For that reason, he'd agree to play along with Erwin's plan on the condition that he takes Mikasa's body back home and gives her a proper burial next to Armin. Naturally, that's something the commander was probably going to do anyway, and as the two of them then shake on it, the scene would flash back to Liberia. On the streets, people would be freaking out as their skin begins to glow, and from Gabi and Falco's perspective, they would think they're about to die. Across the town, thousands of lights would then erupt out of nowhere as every last man, woman and child would transform into a mindless colossal titan. Standing at 60 meters tall, their explosive transformations would destroy what was left of the city, and interestingly, this same thing would be happening all over the world. Due to 2,000 years of colonization, Eldians would exist in countries all around the world. I mean, we've heard this from Udo and also from Annie's dad, so we know they exist in places that we haven't seen. And, I would imagine they come in all sorts of different colors and shapes and sizes. When it comes to Flock, he'd meet his end in Liberia, as Eren would throw his human body like garbage into the path of the marching titans. Over the next 5 days, the rumbling would then reach every corner of the globe, flattening entire civilizations in an unparalleled act of mass murder. With the exception of Paradis, all that would remain would be a barren wasteland, but this act would still be something Eren wanted to do. Flashing forward by a year, a ton of things would change on the island in the time since humanity was wiped out. For a start, Premier Smith would finally take control of the military, as Paradis tries to deal with the influx of refugees. From his point of view, the arrival of Eldians from across the sea would have potential to be a good thing, especially when it comes to the Tybur family. Because the Tyburs have such extensive knowledge of the modern world, in theory the island can keep evolving for generations even without Hizuru's help. The problem is that with Willy being locked up, so far the family would refuse to cooperate in any way, but negotiations with the government would still be underway. Meanwhile, for other foreign Eldians, they'd be having a pretty terrible time, as the majority of them would be victims of various forms of discrimination. Realistically, for many natives on the island, they'd associate the actions of Marley's government with all of the foreigners who are coming from across the sea. that connection would 100% lead to violence against them, and overall, for now, life wouldn't be much better than the internment zones. Now, you might be thinking that these divisions are something that can heal over time, and ordinarily that would be true. However, for Erwin there would be one big concern. 1 year ago, the female and armoured titans were both killed without passing down their abilities. Following that, their powers must have been inherited by 2 eldian babies, who'd currently be somewhere on the island. If either of those kids happen to belong to refugees, then the division between the native and the non-native eldians, it could lead one day to a Titan civil war. That's why Premier Smith's main priorities would be to fix the divide, find those 2 kids, and also find Eren. For the past 11 months, the founder would have been missing, having abandoned society shortly after the rumbling. Even though the rumbling is something Eren wanted to do, the guilt from killing billions of people and getting Mikasa dragged into it'd weigh heavily on his mind. To make things worse, most of the population would worship him like a god, and there wouldn't be a single place he could go without people glorifying what he did. Within weeks of arriving home, all of these factors would cause Eren to have a mental break, and in a moment of madness he'd cut himself off from the world. Since that day, he escaped to the mountains in the north of Paradis, where he'd live a silent and isolated life waiting for the curse of Ymir to take him. That said, on November the 3rd in the year 857, the Attack Titan would secretly make his first journey back to Shiganshina. The significance of this date is that it would be Armin's birthday, in particular the final birthday that Eren would be alive to see. For that reason, he'd make the incredibly long journey back to their hometown, where his best friend would be buried under the tree on the hill. By chance, Historia would also happen to be there that day to pay her respects, and for her, seeing Eren there would be like seeing a ghost. By this point, the military had been searching for him for over 2 years, and rumours began to spread that he'd taken his own life. That's why him being here would feel like he's come back from the dead, and by doing something as simple as giving him a hug, Eren would instantly experience her memories since the day he disappeared. From this, he'd learn how worried Historia has been, how hard his friends searched for him, and he'd feel the suffering of the people he brought to the island. Following this, the two would have a long conversation where Historia pretty much begs him to return to society. From her point of view, because Eren is worshipped by nearly all native Eldians, he could be the one to end the violence between the locals and the refugees. At first, he wouldn't really appreciate this idea, because his self-esteem would be so low by this point that he wouldn't feel as if his words could make a difference to people's hatred. Regardless, Historia would refuse to give up on this, and in the year 858, the final year of Eren's life, he would make a return to the public eye. As you can imagine, this news would literally blow people's minds, and with all of humanity waiting to hear what he has to say, Eren would preach a message of peace between Eldians. In time, this would gradually lead to the formation of a new religion called Jaegerism, but we'll talk more about that later in the video. For now, the last thing to say about Eren himself is that before his death, he'd make a vow to all of his followers. As proof of his commitment to ending the cycle of war, Eren would reject Erwin's wishes and would choose to die without passing down his Titan powers. Instead, he'd allow the curse of Ymir to peacefully take him away when the time comes, and his final words to Historia would simply be that it's time to stop fighting. This final message would form the foundations of Jaegerism, but not everyone would buy into that philosophy. For Erwin, the prospect of civil war would be greater now more than ever, because with Eren's death, his power would be inherited by random babies on the island. In total, this meant the Warhammer, Founder, Attack, Female, and Armoured Titans were all out there in the wild, and if war was to break out in the near future, it's possible, if not likely, the government would lose. Therefore, in the interests of national security, the Commander-in-Chief would have to change his priorities. A few weeks after Eren's death, Erwin would launch an aggressive crackdown in which thousands of kids and babies would be taken from their parents. This level of ruthlessness is something he wouldn't have displayed for years, but in his mind it'd be a necessary sacrifice to save their tiny world. On the flip side of this, in response to hundreds of their children being kidnapped by the state, a new resistance group would form among the refugees. This resistance would be spearheaded by Colt, Gabby and Falco, and they received secret funding from the Tybur family. Moving on, several years later to the year 862, Premier Smith would announce the discovery of 4 of the missing Titans. In particular, the female, Warhammer, Armoured, and Founder would all be tracked down, with 2 of these kids being Eldians from across the sea. During the whole searching process, countless children were experimented on to see if they had healing abilities, leaving a bunch of kids traumatized when they were eventually sent back home. On top of that, the unlucky ones who actually had Titan powers, they would never be sent back, as the government would obviously want to hold on to that power. This would lead to violent clashes and protests with the resistance, who by now would be armed thanks to the Tybur family's support. Soon afterwards, a very brief civil war would then break out on Paradis, as resistance fighters would launch a surprise rescue mission to save their 2 kids. This failed operation would result in half of their forces being killed by the Beast Titan, and for Historia, she'd be horrified by everything going on. Earlier I mentioned how Jaegerism would morph into a religion on the island, one that would revolve around the ideas of peace, freedom, and a stop to the endless violence. As leader of the church, Historia would firmly buy into this ideology, which would put a huge strain on her relationship with Erwin. Gradually, a divide would start to grow between the government and the royal bloodline, with things getting especially bad in the year 868. This would be the year that Historia dies from the curse of Ymir, and despite the military's request, she'd refuse to pass down her titan. With Jaegerism having evolved over the past decade, one of their core beliefs would be that they'd reject the old system of kids having to eat their parents. Instead, Jaegerists would think that all shifters should die a natural death so that the founder Ymir can grant that power to a pure-hearted eldian. Importantly, as we saw with the 4 kids, the ones chosen by Ymir can come from either side of the sea, and so from a Jaegerist perspective, everyone is equal, they're all the same. This belief is something that Historia would pass down to her daughter, and for well over a century, no one from the royal bloodline would inherit a titan again. This is where things get interesting, because in the year 1005, Eldia would be a modern society where although titans exist, they wouldn't have been used for decades. A reason for this is that as the native and non-native populations began to mix, Jaegerism grew to become the dominant religion. This led to a series of events in which 70 years ago, the Jaegerist royal family gained enough support in the public to overthrow the military government. Since then, the monarchy have been the ones in charge, and the current king would be Adam Rice. As Historia's great-great-grandson, Adam inherited the throne in 972, but unlike the rest of his family, he questioned certain aspects of their religion. For example, since the Jaegerists took over, all children would be tested at birth for healing abilities, and if they displayed that power, 2 things would happen. Number 1, they'd be given the status of a saint inside the church, and number 2, they'd be trained by the army for 13 years to control and never to use their titan power. So far, this method would have been successful, but for Adam, he'd view it as dangerous since there's always the risk that one day a random maniac or a traitor might inherit one of the 8 titans. In a minute, I'll explain why there are only 8, but first, to protect the population, in 992, Adam would establish the brand new Church of Eldia. This church would be one that follows most Jaegerist teachings, but with the crucial difference that now, the king can select who inherits titans. Essentially, this meant bringing back the tradition of eldians eating other eldians, but there is a reason why this wouldn't be a huge deal. With Paradis having evolved into a modern civilization, titans would not be a part of everyday life. In fact, they wouldn't have been seen in public since the days of the old military government. As a result, with each passing generation, their power would start to feel more and more irrelevant, and although people would know it's real, the world wouldn't revolve around them like it used to. Shortly after establishing his new church, Adam would then handpick the next inheritors of the 8 titans, giving 4 to the island's most trusted soldiers, 2 to members of the royal bloodline, and the remaining 2 to his closest allies. Their responsibility would be to safeguard these powers for 13 years, until the process repeats itself again. This method was to ensure that titans never interfere with their way of life, which is something Adam had always prioritized. However, unknown to the king, there would be one more titan out there that hadn't been seen since the death of Eren Jaeger. Because he was killed by the curse of Ymir, Eren shifters were divided back to their original forms, with the attack, founder, and warhammer being inherited by 3 random babies. As we know, Premier Smith was able to locate 2 of them, but in the end he died without ever finding the attack titan. Regardless, this missing titan was something the military still continued to look for until decades later when they were overthrown by the Jaegerist royal family. By that time, the attack titan had been gone for almost 80 years, and it was believed by most Jaegerists that the power had died with Eren himself. Therefore, the Rices didn't want or expect to see it ever again, and on the 100th anniversary of Eren's death, the church officially declared there were now only 8 shifters. Of course, the reality was that the attack titan never disappeared, and for generations it had been secretly passed down between members of the resistance. Initially, this group was founded to secure the rights of eldians from across the sea, but by pure coincidence, the baby who inherited the attack titan belonged to one of their members. With the Tybur family's help, the group was eventually able to get their hands on transformation serum, and had passed the Titan between themselves ever since. The reason the Tyburs were so invested in this resistance is that as leaders of Marley for 100 years, they'd have their own ideas for how the island should be run. When we consider all of the unique natural resources that exist on Paradis, including the glowing stones, the special fuel source, and the ultra hard steel, Eldia had the potential to one day be a highly advanced nation. In exchange for his release, Willy Tybur agreed to help make this a reality, but ultimately his goal would be for the Tyburs to gain control of this tiny world. Funding the resistance was just one aspect of that plan, and in the year 995 it'd start to pay off in a big way. By this point, generations of Tyburs would have helped to fully modernize the island, but so far they'd have failed to take over in the way Willy intended. However, in 995 that would begin to change with the appointment of Henry Tybur as head of the Tybur family. As the youngest of 5 siblings, Henry would be by far the most gifted, having earned a reputation as a kid for his strategic thinking. Consequently, he was made family head on one condition, which is that he dedicates his life to overthrowing the royal bloodline, pretty much by any means necessary. This is where the resistance comes in, because after 137 years of being a thing, the aims of this group would have drastically evolved. Considering that by now all eldians are native to the island, there wouldn't be that same need that there was in the beginning to fight for their rights. At the same time, a lot of eldians from across the sea developed a deep sense of loyalty to the Tyburs, mainly thanks to all of the funding and support that they gave in the beginning, and a lot of these people believed that the Tyburs are the true royal family. The descendants of those fighters would still be part of the group today, and their loyalty would be essential to Henry's plan. His main strategy here would be a scheme to exploit the weaknesses of the king, in particular his desire for humans to move on from the power of the Titans. From Adam's perspective, Titans would have no place in the modern world, which is why he entrusted them to people who he knew would never use them. On the flip side of this, Henry would know that in this world that the Tyburs helped create, there isn't a single weapon left that can kill a Titan shifter. This might seem strange given that they're so far in the future, but remember, in the past, nations developed these weapons in response to the constant threat of Marley. In 995 though, there hadn't been a Titan incident for generations. In fact, ever since the Rumbling, shifters had only been used twice in battle. For that reason, the island just wasn't built to handle Titan attacks, and it's why Adam had always been so desperate to get them under his control. In exactly 10 years' time, King Rice would once again have to pick new candidates for each shifter, and Henry's plan was to manipulate events so that Adam unknowingly chooses members of the resistance. Through various acts of sabotage, bribery, and politics over the next decade, Henry would turn himself into the king's most trusted advisor, and a key figure in the Church of Eldia. Recently, it would also have been the 150th anniversary of when the Tyburs lost the Warhammer Titan, and to commemorate this, Henry would secretly fund a campaign in the media for its power to be returned. This campaign would put a ton of pressure on the king, who was aware of his friend's huge popularity with young people. Speaking of young people, within the army there were dozens of undercover resistance members, but by far the most promising were Mia and Noah. Besides being naturally talented, these two would have Henry's full support behind the scenes, who would influence the king similar to how Marcel influenced Marley back in the day. Following that, when the time eventually came to make a decision, Adam would go on to make the biggest mistake of his life. By caving in to pressure from the media and by falling for Henry's lies, King Rice would hand the Warhammer Titan back to the Tybur family. With this decision, years of meticulous planning would finally pay off for the resistance, as they now have 2 shifters under their control. All that would be left to discover is which shifters Noah and Mia would get, as the king would make his choice based on military recommendations. That's how the Colossal Titan would end up getting inherited by Noah, while the Founding Titan would find itself a new owner. Ever since Eren's death, the founder never returned to the royal family out of fear that with the outside world being destroyed, it's possible Karl Fritz's vow to renounce war isn't a thing anymore. At the time, Premier Smith didn't want Historia or her descendants to potentially have that power, and so the military government kept it under their control. Similarly, the current king would have that same belief, as like I said, his philosophy is that humans should embrace the future and leave Titan powers in the past. That's why back in 992, the founder was given to one of the 4 soldiers who obviously couldn't use its power due to not having royal blood. Seeing that weakness, the Tybur family worked for a decade using underhanded methods to gain influence inside the military. That influence was necessary so that when the time came, their chosen candidate Mia would be the one to inherit the founder. Flashing forward 2 months, In the summer of 1005, the Rice family would be in Shiganshina for the grand opening of a new skyscraper. Hours into the event, everything would seem pretty fine, until, out of nowhere, the colossal titan would manifest behind the king. With a swipe of his hand, Noah would crush the entire Rice family, including Adam's grandchildren, seemingly putting an end to the royal bloodline. Meanwhile, on the streets below, the armoured titan would rush to the scene, but on the way there, he'd be ambushed by Henry and the missing attack titan. With that said, my friends, that is where this video ends, and if you made it this far, I want to thank you for watching all the way. Initially, when I began writing this, it was meant to be a quick recap of the Irving Colossal timeline that I started a couple of years ago, but as I started to make changes, everything kind of spiraled out of control, and in my opinion, it's more interesting now. I kind of thought it would be cool to see a world where titans all still exist just on this tiny island, and the politics involved with that as well. I thought it would be pretty interesting. As always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you feel like it. And on screen, there should be a couple videos that are similar to this one. I did do a My Hero Academia video similar to this a few years ago, so that is on screen now. And yeah, until the next one, peace out.